Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where we all love technology, right? But we have discussed on this Daily Tech Podcast the dangers of injecting our bias into AI algorithms, albeit unwittingly, of course. And on a positive note, we've also discussed how, although many see AI and automation as a threat to their jobs, maybe setting them free from performing mundane and repetitive tasks and teaching employees to add value through creativity, strategic thinking and management is actually a good thing. But today, I wanted to get everybody listening to think even bigger than that. And I want to talk about something that I've only just recently discovered, which is ghost work. And a book called Ghost Work: How to Stop Silicon Valley from Building a New Global Underclass is essentially an expose of the invisible human workforce that is powering the web that we all take for granted and could possibly foreshadow the future of work too. It's a great read, and I invited the author, Mary L. Gray, onto the podcast, and someone I just hit it off with straight away. So much valuable insights that she shares on this episode. So I urge everyone listening to burst out of your tech-loving echo chamber and hear more about a story that might challenge a few worldviews out there and get you to think bigger. So let's get Mary onto the show to talk about it now. So a massive warm welcome to the podcast, Mary. Can you tell the listeners a little bit more about who you are and what you do?
I'm a senior principal researcher at Microsoft Research, which is the independent basic science branch of Microsoft. And I'm also a fellow at the E.J. Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard University. I'm a faculty member in computer science and informatics and engineering at Indiana University, and I keep affiliations with the anthropology and gender studies departments there.
Fantastic. Well, I'm really excited to get you on today, and there's so much we're going to be talking about. But before we get into that, could I just ask that you set the scene and tell the listeners a little bit more about how you were a senior researcher at Microsoft Research and how it helped you inspire your book, which is called Ghost Work: How to Stop Silicon Valley from Building a New Global Underclass? Because it's a great read, but I'd love to hear the story behind it.
Well, it all started with coming to Microsoft Research from Indiana University to take a leave to think about questions of artificial intelligence and its impact on society. Most of my work looks at how access to technology shape people's lives and everyday uses of technologies as part and parcel of what we do to earn our livings, to shape our worlds, our identities. And most of my research has been looking at what rural communities in the United States do with technologies, both their presence and their absence, how they deal with often a lack of opportunity because of the absence of technology. So when I came to Microsoft Research, I wanted to understand, what is this thing, artificial intelligence? How does it work? How is it built? And I started asking my colleagues, engineers and computer scientists, what goes into making AI. And this was back in 2013. Early days, they started talking with me about machine learning and how most of building artificial intelligence really depends on doing these different techniques that draw on large stores of data. And the data, it's pretty much what you and I produce every day when we're online, just moments of decision making. Well, they need all that data, which often is somewhat messy, sloppy data that's not in any particular organization, to be structured. And they talk about it as training data to be able to model decision making. So you need to have enough examples of how somebody makes a decision and how lots of people make broadly sets of decisions to be able to have a decision that a person might make automated. It turns out that because all that data is often so messy, it's not labeled, it's out of context, that they hire people to add metadata, add information to clean up the training data, to make sure it's as clear case of decisions around, say, whether you choose a specific website when you're searching with a set of terms, or in the case of something like content, if you're trying to identify, is that perhaps a piece of hate speech or pornography, that you really can't just rely on how the user might have noted that material, that you hire people to be able to clarify what is that material that is going into the data set that's training algorithms. And when I asked them, so who are these people you're hiring? Where are they? I would get the range of responses from, I don't really know, and just kind of a shrug, and we'd move on and they'd continue to talk about machine learning techniques, to engineers who would pause and say, I don't really know, but that's the beauty of this system we have called human computation, which is a very lovely tool for being able to draw a person into a computational process to have them annotate training data. And then I met folks who said, I don't know, and I'm afraid to find out, because they were clearly worried about not really knowing who was doing this, but imagining it's done often by the task. So image labeling, for example, if they had a lot of images that needed to be labeled more clearly as dogs, cats, sofas, whatever it might be, they had no idea who was necessarily picking up these tasks that often paid pennies a pop, but they did wonder if perhaps they might be people who were not in the best circumstances. So I found the perfect partner for this research, a computer scientist, Siddharth Suri, who was in the New York City lab. And he spent the past years really pioneering this technique of what's called human computation, where you would have an application programming interface, just a piece of software, be able to call up a person and have them deliver a very specific service of adding a label or adding keywords to threads of terms, and then being able to pull in what they produce and match it with computational processes to automatically kind of sew together a decision. So he was deeply curious about who these people are, because he's worked with them for years. And much to his chagrin, he probably didn't know what I was asking of him, but I said, let's do an ethnography of the people who do the work that both trains artificial intelligence, but also for a lot of startups is a process that keeps a person in a loop to deliver a piece of information in a moment of snap judgment.
So these people, they're invisible to you and I, which you would kind of expect, but the fact that they're invisible to the businesses themselves is just fascinating, isn't it? So when looking at these research findings, what did you find, and what does it mean for the future of employment, did you think?
I mean, what's fascinating is because these operations happen so quickly. So take the example of something like content moderation, which I think for the average listener, odds are pretty good. They're only recently coming to understand that there are people who are effectively, often in real time, past information. It might be a trending topic or a specific image from a live stream video, and asked to evaluate, is there something disturbing or something inappropriate about this material? That's a really good example of work that people are doing very quickly on the fly. They're bringing what humans do best, which is our ability to spontaneously respond to something without any real prior information, and be able to offer a judgment of a moment of evaluation. That's a good example of the effort to develop automated systems for detecting material is really the focal point for the engineer, and it's the focal point for the company that's very much invested in how do we make the process of evaluating user-generated content faster, more effective, that nobody's really paying attention to this long labor supply chain that's constantly coming in and out to do this kind of work. So like so much contingent work, temp work that you might think of like seasonal work, we're often desperately dependent on somebody for that moment. And then it's pretty easy to forget what their conditions might be for work, what the payment might be, because we're moving on to the next problem. So, in fact, I think the big challenge here is they are invisible to most of these businesses. They're easy to forget because of that moment of desperate urgency. They're often needed in a moment of everybody depending on what's happening, and then we're rushing on to the next thing. And I think we can all relate to those moments when somebody helps us, say when we spill a coffee on the table, we're desperate to find a rag and somebody who will help us sop it up. We're not thinking about what the life and the work conditions are of that person. We're so completely fixated on the problem we need to fix immediately. And I think that that's precisely what's happening in these work environments.
And as AI and machine learning is entering the mainstream now, and every business seems to be thinking about it and adopting it, especially if you read any Gartner survey or predictions there. And we've reached that time of the year where everyone's looking at the big tech trends to follow next year. Are you seeing more and more businesses in and outside of tech relying on these ghost workers?
Absolutely. And I think this is the trends to follow, and it's several trends colliding, is that we have more and more businesses that are trying to take advantage of the large stores of data that people produce when they're living their lives online, when they're going to health appointments, when they're talking with their physical therapists or talking with anyone who's providing training, in any setting. We're constantly producing all of this information that could be useful for modeling, improving efficiencies, improving decision making, that offload some of what we're doing day to day. We're looking at what are those routines that we could automate. Computation software is fantastic at automating anything where you've got a reliable yes or no answer, or something that happens routinely and doesn't change at all. The place where we constantly need people are evaluating data that's a little bit exceptional, the outliers, the edge cases. So where in health, for example, we might have outcomes that don't quite look typical statistically, we're constantly trying to make sense of what's going on there for a particular patient population. This is true in customer service. So you've got so many different sectors that are trying to learn from all the data that we're producing as consumers and businesses. You've also got this trend towards service economies, that much of what we do in our economic activity day to day, it's providing each other with a service. Manufacturing is actually not that hard to technically automate, even though it's still a really technically hard challenge. But in fact, so much of manufacturing jobs have effectively been able to be almost not fully automated, but moving us to that image of robots, because you can bolt down all of the variables that the mechanized process, from the factory floor to the staging of product boxing, all of that can be automated. So a lot of that sector of manufacturing sector, it has been automated, and it has displaced people probably as much as it can. What we haven't been tracking is this semi-automated world of service and information work, knowledge work, that can also be, at least in part, sourced, scheduled, managed, shipped, and billed through an application programming interface in the internet. So this world of work, this collision, is really service industries that cut across all sectors, whether it's healthcare, customer service, retail, or any kind of experience, entertainment. All of that is effectively information services, and it's colliding with this mechanism of human computation, being able to use contract task-based work to bring people on the spot to fill a request. That's not a niche job. That is literally the dismantlement of full-time employment in any industry that manages and shuttles information. That's what we're not tracking, is this is a reorganization of the way we orient to work.
And the big question, of course, is who are the people doing this ghost work? Is it a particular kind of person with a certain type of background, or
Yeah.
is a skill set required? Who are these people?
Yeah, they're you and me. I mean,
Yeah.
I think at the end of the day, and that was the most fascinating part of this research of studying India and the United States, looking at workers across 4 different platforms, 4 different business models, the range of task-based work from image tagging, basically data labeling, putting a key term to an image or a piece of text, to captioning and translation of video, which is effectively operating as a linguist, as you might see in the UN, producing content of all kind between all 4 of these platforms, and looking at thousands of workers' surveys of questions we had about their work, but also sitting with hundreds of people and interviewing them and seeing their day-to-day. We've amassed this comprehensive picture of who are the people who do this work, and they really are the same people who do office work around the world. They often, and this is probably the most important element, they often have college degrees. So this isn't simple work. It actually requires quite a bit of cognitive capacity to be able to write material, to be able to make decisions about evaluating information. So they're trained. If there's any significant data point that really stands out, is that these are often first-generation college goers. So they're just entering this world of knowledge work. They don't have the social ties that might guarantee them a career, but they are really a reflection of what is the state of employment broadly around the world. Whether we're talking about India or the United States, we're mostly looking at job development in the service sector. So their other options, other than doing at-home task-based work, would look like working 9-to-5 shift work for a retail store, for a food chain. And those aren't inherently bad jobs either. It's that they don't come with any more or less security than on-demand work. None of them those are not salaried positions. They often also they don't give people many options about choosing what time they work. And that was a critical feature of the people we met. They often were trying to meet really 3 needs in their lives. They needed to control their time. They often had constraints on their time. So this is not about flexibility. This is really about people who are caring for young children or caring for aging adults. They might have other educational goals or commitments, other job commitments, and they're working around those time constraints. So they have a real need to control their schedules. The other thing they're looking for, they want to be able to choose projects. They have other interests than what might be available to them in their day-to-day opportunities in the formal sector. And this is a way for them to be able to sample a range of projects that may or may not be satisfying. It depended on the worker we interviewed, but it is an experience of choosing what they do, which for many people we don't get to make that choice unless you're in a very established career, high-profile position. And then the third thing many people were looking for was controlling who they were collaborating with. So we met a sizable number of workers who felt marginalized in formal employment because of their gender, because of their age, because of their race, because of their religious backgrounds. So we're looking at a reflection of what's not working in formal employment. But I think we're also seeing the limits of what right now service sector work offers the average person. So there wasn't one type of worker. What was really striking, and I think this goes to core to what's quite different about this labor market, is that there were people who were effectively always on. They had oriented to this work. They didn't work for one platform. They didn't do one kind of gig work. They often chose a couple. And they had committed to making this their full-time income stream. So they effectively had turned these platforms into their full-time place of employment. But there was this sizable group, a good 35% of people we interviewed were what we'd call regulars. This might be the mom who's caring for her kids and her aging parents women like Kala and Joan that we met in our research, who have other commitments that make choosing a particular number of hours or number of days or projects effectively their target. And then they had other income streams that they were building out. So they didn't really have one job. They had many different projects, different contracts that were effectively what they bundled together for their income. And this was a really important resource for them. It wasn't their only resource, but importantly, they effectively make this labor market work, because if you're a consumer or a business using these services, you can't tell the difference between somebody who's always on and a regular. So they're what effectively swell this commons, this abundance of people available to us as consumers and businesses that aren't just relying on one person. We're actually relying on the availability of many people. That is what's dramatically different about orienting to effectively a commons that's available to many requesters who are calling for help. And then there's this long tail of people experimenting. So we call them experimentalists. It's like a good 70% of the people who are on these platforms. They do one or two projects. They often are people who tries it out, and it's beguiling. It's too difficult to figure out how to make any money off of these sites. And in some cases, he may stick around, try one more project, and realize, no, he can't do this. The number of workers we met who said it was meeting other workers and plugging into networks that are off these platforms, that made all the difference whether they stuck around. But for him, he never came across any of those forums or other settings, and he left. But importantly, he's still adding value. I think the tough thing is that for most of these labor markets that we're building out through project task-based work, they are completely reliant on all three types of workers. There's no way to turn this into full-time employment. There's no way to get the experimentalists out of the way, because they are basically the pipeline to building out regulars and always on.
Wow. And we are all surrounded by shiny new technologies now that all, let's face it, feeds our insatiable desire for instant gratification and convenience. But we seldom hear or think about these vulnerable participants that are right at the heart of the tech that's making it all possible. So for anyone listening today, just like you and I, what is the critical message that you want people to take away from the book?
To realize how many people are making this experience of always being able to find someone available to either deliver food or to improve our web searches, that they're providing this really vital service to us. It's fleeting, and we've never learned how to value the contingent work that's often necessary in a moment, often in a moment of crisis, and then is something that we can feel some sense of relief or assurance. And we forget that in order for it to be available the next time we have an urgent need, it needs to be underwritten. So what I hope readers take away from our book is that, right now we have millions of people who are providing this service, either to build artificial intelligence or literally to be that human in the loop serving us, and that we have to reorient our support of employment to be able to shore up, to sustain what they're offering, which is not just a moment of service, but literally their availability.
Absolutely. And of course, with great power comes great responsibility, as I learned in Spider-Man as a young boy. But for tech leaders and business leaders listening, is there any message you can offer to them about how they can address this and create greater accountability and a culture to support these ghost workers?
I think right now it is literally coming to grips with how dependent their value proposition is, not just on software, but on human contributions to this shared commons, this abundance. And so for businesses, it's literally saying, I'm going to take on the responsibility, the accountability to these contract workers who make what I do possible. We don't have labor laws that hold businesses accountable to employees outside of their own ranks.
Yeah.
The reality is every business is extracting value from people who are maybe on paper, in some cases, someone's employee, but increasingly are part of the 1.1 million in the UK, the 10.7 million in the United States who are doing some form of task-based work at some point during the year. So companies have to recognize that in order for them to be able to continually go back to this contingent workforce, they're going to have to distribute more value of the value they're extracting from those workers to underwrite that workforce. That could look like portable benefits, meaning that it's no longer about saving all your resources for your core employees, but recognizing the value of that labor supply chain that literally wraps around the world, and coming up with mechanisms that really pay their fair share for making sure that those workers are available, not just today, but tomorrow.
So do you think we're heading towards a world in which invisible armies of online workers are ultimately hired, tasked, managed, paid, and often fired by machines? Or are you more optimistic that we need a turnaround and we can actually make that happen?
So in many ways, I'd reframe the question
Yeah.
and see it as this opportunity to draw on the resources of algorithmically bringing some efficiency to sourcing, scheduling, managing, shipping, billing, task-based information service work, and recognizing software always fails. So our biggest problem right now is thinking that algorithmic management is perfect or is good enough, and having no recourse for the workers who end up getting caught in its gears. Businesses and consumers have to be accountable to those workers. That's what we're missing. So it doesn't have to be a bad thing to have workers participating in task-based work. What's required is recognizing how valuable it is to be able to rely on contingent workers who are doing this information service work off-site for many employers. That's what we're missing, is a reevaluation of what does it mean to truly acknowledge how important it is to have a standing army of people who are not on site. They don't have to be invisible. That in many ways is a choice we're making.
Yeah.
We're ignoring them. They're not just invisible. So to be able to see that for businesses, they absolutely, and in the businesses that we studied in the book, when businesses put more attention on the workers and center them in their modes of productivity, they get higher data quality. They get better results. So recognizing that there is some upfront investment that's going to get you long-term gain, that used to be why we bothered with having employees.
Yeah.
That hasn't changed. The challenge in front of us is literally saying, if somebody is off-site and they're producing value for me, what's the fair transaction? Not what can I get away with, but literally what's the fair transaction to recognize the collective contribution of people putting into that commons, into that pool.
And I am conscious we have focused on the dangers of technology, but in the interest of balance, is there anything that excites you about tech and the future of tech in the workplace?
Absolutely. I mean, this book, despite the menacing title, is it's actually, Neil, it's optimistic. Cool. Because we are literally at the beginning of reorienting employment to being task-based, being off-site, being highly distributed, and in fact, completely dependent on this aggregation of people's effort. So those are the big trends to watch, that we are literally shifting from a focus on a factory floor and an assembly line to focusing on recognizing people's shared contributions, aggregated. The promise in that is we no longer have to make a decision at an early point in our lives. Most people's economic lives are made up of moving from opportunity to opportunity to opportunity. That's been true around the globe, more so than not. And it's recognizing that does not have to be inherently risky so that we really are getting the value that people have to offer by entering this commons. So what makes me really optimistic is this could be the beginning of people being able to control their schedules, be able to make more choices about what projects they work on, and being able to collaborate in ways that really take advantage of the peer-to-peer collaboration that anybody who's ever worked in a good functioning team knows that's how you produce really good outcomes. You have to be a jerk to be the person who says, I accomplished this entirely on my own. And so it's literally moving employment to a place that recognizes that none of us accomplish any of the big things by ourselves. It is a shared effort, and we often don't distribute the kudos equitably. And so what will it look like to be able to have a more equitable distribution of the value that people are making when they contribute to what are, in most cases, a team effort? Something like service, when you're caring for somebody, and I love bringing it to the domain of healthcare. When you're caring for someone who's sick, you've got a surgeon who may have performed a really important task. You've got all of the nurses' aides, the janitors, making sure that person gets healthy. They are all part of a positive outcome when somebody walks out the door in a hospital. So thinking about information service work and how we're going to be building out all of these moments of being able to support people's health that might look like a text message that says, hey, did you take your medication? Or a text message from someone who's checking in on your heart rate because it seems a little high. Like, those are going to be all these light touches that we can bring through this augmentation of what humans are doing and what computation can do. Like, really building out the complementarity of those. But there's no point in trying to make that a full-time job, because no one person could ever deliver what any of us need in terms of our health, in terms of any service. We really need that larger support team that's constantly checking in, because it would be exhausting for one person to take that on by themselves.
I completely agree. I think that's an incredibly powerful moment to end this podcast on. But for anybody listening that would like to delve in a little bit deeper on the subject, can you remind them of your website? Does the book have a website? And equally, the best way of contacting you if people are left with any other questions or want to carry that conversation on?
We put all of our public talks and published papers on the website for the book at www.ghostwork.info. And you can also find a reader guide there that'll guide you through each of the chapters and some key statistics from the book. And I welcome anybody contacting me and sharing their experience if they're doing this kind of work and they see themselves reflected in the book. We love to hear from people who are doing this work, and recognizing that right now it comes with a lot of hardship. And so the goal is to humanize this work and help people see how often there are people in the background who are helping them achieve everything from a better search result to having better healthcare outcomes. So hopefully if listeners are interested and workers are out there listening, they'll contact us about the book.
Fantastic. Well, I'll add all those links to the show notes and the blog post that will accompany this episode, just so people can find that nice and easily. But one of the things I always say at the end of every episode is technology works best when it brings people together. But what you're doing here and humanizing work, or at least advising businesses to humanize this work that we all take for granted, is a beautiful thing. So a big thank you for coming on and increasing my awareness, and hopefully everyone listening today. So thanks again.
Thanks, Neil.
An estimated 8% of Americans have worked at least once in this ghost economy that we talked about today. And that number is growing. And the fact that they usually learn legal minimums for traditional work and have no health benefits and can be fired at any time for little or no reason means it's a subject that we must talk about, because there are no labour laws to govern that kind of work. So for me, the book was a big wake-up call and enabled me to look at the world of tech a little differently, and also think bigger. And I think it's so important to read things that challenge our belief systems and help us obtain a more well-rounded opinion of where we are and where we are heading. That is the sweet spot. But were there any surprises or takeaways from today's conversation that you'd like to share with me and everybody listening? The aim of this podcast is to get more opinions and insights on this topic so we can all talk about it together. And you can do that by simply emailing me, techblogwriter@outlook.com, or tweet me at Neil C. Hughes. So a big thank you to Mary L. Gray, co-author of Ghostwork, for coming on the podcast today and reminding us how services delivered by companies such as the Amazons of this world, Google, Microsoft and Uber can only function smoothly thanks to the judgment and experience of the increasingly invisible human labour force. And finally, an even bigger thank you to each and every one of you for turning up and listening each day. And not only that, for sending your thoughts and experiences too. What a beautiful thing we're creating together here, right? But before I get too emotional, I'm going to sign off now. So a big thank you for listening. And until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.